carrying on the DBCA theme, we've got Ian Radford coming up now. Ian's a fire ecologist for Department of Biodiversity, Conservation and Attraction. And I think you're going to just do a short PowerPoint, Ian, for us on the role of fire in savanna landscapes and results you've learnt from your ecology research. Yep, thank you.
Now, which button is it that I have to push? The big one. Ah, the big one.
Yep. One at a time.
Righty.
I'll say it.
Alrighty, I've called this Kimberley Journey Towards Best Practice Fire Management and Evidence-Based Research on Wildlife Responses to Fire Management because it is a journey, and just as an aside, well done for staying through for this long. It's been quite a lot of talks. So, a journey towards optimal fire management for wildlife in the North Kimberley. For a long time, research in Northern Australia has really been suggesting that while most wildlife in the savannas is fairly fire resilient, some isn't. That includes the Gouldian finch that we heard about and other finches, grass finches that we heard about earlier tonight. But also small and medium-sized mammals are another group that are definitely not resilient to fire, and in fact fire is one of their key threatening processes. But our research, despite that, even though it sounds contradictory, our research in the Kimberley shows that doing no fire management is much worse for those animals than doing fire management. Threatened mammals have responded positively in the North Kimberley in particular to some types of fire management. And in this talk, I'll be detailing the research which provides the evidence base from which Kimberley DBCA fire management is planned and implemented, particularly in the North Kimberley. So in the beginning, when I started in the Kimberley, which is obviously not quite in the beginning, but it's around 2005, and we started doing quite a bit of field work from 2007 onwards. There are a lot of places where, when we looked and put out traps, we didn't find many mammals, or we didn't find all the species that were supposed to be there. So I can remember doing 3 weeks of trapping on the Mitchell Plateau in 2007 and catching 3 animals for that whole time. So, and even where mammals were a little bit more abundant in the sandstone country, in the Mitchell Plateau, we were still only getting a few species that should have been there. So we were getting some of the common species like the common rock rat, the delicate mouse, quolls, and a couple of species of bandicoots, but we weren't getting any of the tree rats. We got very few of the Kimberley rock rats. We didn't get any of those, the golden-backed tree rat, the brush-tailed rabbit rat, or the black-footed tree rat. So I was worried at that stage whether I was ever going to see these species, because the fact was that whole suite of species was collapsing at that time in the Northern Territory. And so I was sort of actually wondering what's happening. Is this happening in the Kimberley as well when I first started in around 2007? So this is just an example of some of the species we got in the green. So we got monjons, or we could see them at least. There's bandicoots and quolls and some of the rodents, but we didn't get any of the tree, or virtually none of the tree rats, and we only got a few of the Kimberley rock rats, which is that big grey one over here. We didn't get any scaly-tailed possums. They only came to light more lately as well. So what were fire regimes doing at that time, back when I started doing this work? Well, they were pretty wild up in the North Kimberley, in the Mitchell and Prince Regent in particular. Enormous wildfires in the late dry season. An example of that is that 2007, the whole of Mitchell River National Park burnt, and the whole of Prince Regent National Park burnt. So there was prescribed burning done in those days, but generally it was fairly small scale or not very effective because it was poorly timed, because at that time there wasn't the amount of money there is now, investment in basically in fire management, and so you had one chance to do the fire management, and sometimes that is mistimed. And there was certainly no landscape scale application of fire like there is now. So this is an example. This is actually 2007. You'll see that, so they're just like in previous slides of some of the other presenters, the red is late dry season fires, so that's fires from July onwards, and the green is early dry season fires. You can see just huge areas burnt across a lot of, particularly the North Kimberley and the West Kimberley. And this was not just a single year, this was actually happened for that whole decade pretty much. You can see that in 2000, 2003, 2005, 2007 and in 2009 as well, huge areas of burnt. And so it's almost like a boom-bust sort of cycle where the whole area is burnt all at once. So this is when our department and other groups started to look at the implementation of landscape scale burning. And this was based on the evidence from scientific literature at the time, which pointed to large, intense wildfires being the worst possible thing for mammals. And that's based on research that was done in the 90s by CSIRO in particular in Kapalga in Kakadu in the Northern Territory. So DBCA and predecessors and also other organisations like the Australian Wildlife Conservancy and a lot of the Aboriginal corporations started to increase their investments in prescribed burning, and that includes carbon projects, which has provided some funding to do that. And just basically the initial aim was to reduce the impact of those and the runs of those large high impact wildfires. At the same time, some of the groups also implemented monitoring programs to try and look at what the impacts or the outcomes of those, basically to provide a report card on what the results of those wildfires were in terms of the biodiversity that we were interested in. So necessarily a lot of this burning was done through aerial ignitions, because a lot of this country is just remote and rugged and inaccessible. So it's the only way we could get in there to do that kind of work. And again, red is late season, green is early season. I don't know if you can see, but above the line was basically pre-extensive fire management, and that's right up until 2007. And after that, things got better. Well, at least things changed. There's a much more prescribed burning, much less of the wildfires, and the fire scars are smaller. But you'll notice in the graph below that it actually hasn't decreased the total amount of area burnt, because we think, to some extent at least, that is determined by just climate and productivity of the soil. It's not actually something we can necessarily affect. But what has changed is there's more early dry season burning and less late dry season burning. And this is the same sort of pattern that's been shown in Prince Regent as well. So you can see from 2000 through to 2010, you've got this boom-bust cycle of large fires, and from 2011 onwards, you've got a much more finer grain mosaic going on. And sort of, if you just want to have a nice contrast, but between 2007, when there was all these extensive wildfires, compared with 2021, when across a lot of the Kimberley, not just on our land, but like on our tenure rather, but also in a lot of the Aboriginal corporations, AWC, all that country where a lot of prescribed burning is done, you can see that the pattern has changed completely from what happened before, and there's a lot less of the late dry season wildfires. So what happened to the mammals when all this broad-scale mosaics were being applied in the North Kimberley? Well, you've seen that the fire regime changed, and there's a few people who've said that, a few presenters that have also made that point. But also the mammal abundance increased. Not only did the mammal abundance increase in the Mitchell Plateau, for instance, but species that I'd expected to be catching early on appeared. They reappeared from somewhere. I don't know where they came from, but they were still obviously somewhere in the landscape, and they came back. So, for instance, I hadn't seen a golden-backed tree rat until 2011, but I'd been trapping in 2007, 8, 9 and 10, and we continued to trap after that, but yes, that's the first time that they turned up. Anyway. Yes, and no one had seen the black-footed tree rat, for instance, in the Kimberley since 1987, and it turned up in 2018 at Baxton Creek, so that under this better fire management. And similarly at Mount Hart, we've also, under good fire management, also removal of cattle, we've had very good responses in the mammals, amongst the mammals in those areas. This is just an example of the tree rats that have come back, have been particularly responsive to better fire management, or, well, I'll call it better fire management. And also you can see there that that's the data on improvements. So basically in the Mitchell Plateau, there was a doubling of the abundance of, or at least trap success of those animals at the sites between pre-management times and post-management times. And this is a golden-backed tree rat in the middle, black-footed tree rat, and the brush-tailed rabbit rat. So do we know what the mammals are responding to within this fire regime? Because as a lot of people realise, fire regimes are extremely complex. So we know that mammals respond very negatively to, if their site where we trap them is extensively burnt around them, around that area, you don't get many mammals. But a little bit of fire around the areas where you're trapping isn't a bad thing. So we found that the peak abundance of mammals was around 25% of the country around their sites are burnt, then you'll get more, that's where you'll get most mammals. They responded negatively to higher fire frequency. So that goes back to a few things that were said earlier. They responded positively to time since fire. In other words, they liked longer unburnt vegetation, basically. And they responded more positively to longer unburnt vegetation if it was a large patch of unburnt vegetation. So 500 hectares or 5 kilometres squared, if possible. Yes, and also, even if the site was burnt where the actual trap site was, if there were long unburnt patches in the area and close by, then there was also more likely to be a reasonable abundance of mammals. So I mentioned before that we found that mammal trap success increased with time since fire. So these graphs over here, the brown line is trap success of mammals, and the blue columns are fire intervals. So that's the average number of years since the last fire. So as what we've found in our research, and this is only coming to light in more recent years with a lot of data, is that in areas where the average time since fire increases at the sites, you get more mammals. And in areas, for instance, the one at the bottom, where the time since fire has decreased, you get fewer mammals. So the point I want to make here is that if you look at these maps here, the green patches are patches of 4 years plus unburnt vegetation. So you can see in the pre-management period, there was a lot less of them in the Prince region, for instance, than there is now under much more intensive fine-scale fire management, fire application. So this is better, basically, for those small mammals. So monitoring from our year of monitoring to inform management each year. And it's not always good news, and sometimes you have bad years, everyone knows that. Also, sometimes some of the techniques we try aren't as effective as we'd like. And when this happens, we can feed that back. Because we've got the evidence, we can feed that back to the management cycle. And an example of this is some of this burning we've been doing in the North Kimberley, which is very fine-grained mosaic, which you would think is exactly what is the thing to be doing, but we're finding that it's not as effective as we thought it would be. So, for instance, those Mount Trafalgar sites, you can see there those graphs are of, at the top, its abundance or trap success, and you can see that the Mount Trafalgar sites, the trap success is not doing that well. On the other hand, you've got the Mount Hart sites that are doing very, very well, and the Silent Grove sites that are staying pretty much the same, so they're stable. Why is this the case? I mean, we don't necessarily know this, so this is why it then becomes a research question. What's going wrong in those circumstances? And this is where we were able to try and, through analysis of the data that we have, we can see that the best improvements or the greatest improvements in mammals are happening where not only have we got longer unburnt fuel, but there's large patches of it. So the blue line over there on that graph is patches that are bigger than 500 hectares, basically. And so one of the reasons we might not be getting the improvements that we think we should be in the Prince region, around Mount Trafalgar at least, is because the patch sizes aren't big enough. But this is something we only know this because we're doing the research on it. So just to illustrate that point, those black squares in here, are 5 kilometre square boxes, basically. The different colours are different times since the last fire. The purple is the patches of vegetation that are 4 years or more since the last fire. So in terms of interpreting this in terms of what we know now about the size of the patches of long unburnt vegetation, there's not many of those patches of purple that are bigger or as big as the 5 kilometre square blocks. So we can now feed that back to management and we can try and achieve that. But one of the cost benefits of that is the bigger you make those patches, the more likely they are to be hit by lightning strikes and burn. So it's obviously a bit of a balancing process about how to achieve that, and that's what we continue to try and develop as we move forward with this sort of analysis. So just in summary, I believe from the results that we have that fire management leads to better outcomes than no fire management. Monitoring provides evidence base for our DBC fire management that we undertake, and not all types of fire management are equally good. Some are better than others, but by monitoring this with going out there every year and retrapping, we can provide the ability to distinguish the good from the bad management and to work out why that's happening and try and make it better. And that's it.